Since early September, amidst a massive buildup of U.S. military power in the region, the United States has engaged in an unprecedented campaign of lethal strikes on vessels in the Caribbean Sea, with President Trump declaring the operations part of a so-called armed conflict against narco-terrorist groups. As of today, there have been at least 7 strikes that have killed more than 30 people. Last week, for the first time, one of the U.S. military strikes left 2 survivors who were held in U.S. military custody briefly before being repatriated to Colombia and Ecuador. Meanwhile, the head of the U.S. military Southern Command announced his resignation, and members of Congress are calling for hearings into the administration's asserted authority to conduct killings outside of any legal process. What law governs these strikes? What happens if more survivors are detained? And as the strikes continue, is the Trump administration intending to provoke a war with Venezuela or other states in the region? This is the Just Security Podcast. I'm your host, Tess Bridgeman. Joining me today are Rebecca Ingber and Brian Finucane. Rebecca is a professor of law at Cardoso Law School and a senior fellow at the Reese Center on Law and Security, as is Brian. Rebecca has years of experience in the State Department's Office of the Legal Advisor, most recently serving as counselor on international law. Brian is a senior advisor at the International Crisis Group and also previously served at the State Department's Office of the Legal Advisor, specializing in the use of force and counterterrorism law. Welcome back to both of you. The latest since we had occasion to discuss the situation in the Caribbean is that we're now up to 7 lethal strikes. Reportedly, 32 people have been killed, and the Navy briefly held 2 survivors of one of the strikes on a ship in international waters before repatriating them to Colombia and Ecuador, respectively. To bring us up to speed on what happened with that brief episode of military detention, and maybe just give us a little bit of context of what it means for the Trump administration's legal theory that we're in an armed conflict with these groups, to have detained these 2 survivors and then let them go, and what it means that they weren't brought to the United States to be prosecuted. Could you talk us through your views on that, Beck?
Yeah, sure. So, first of all, I think we've got to stop meeting like this. Uh, it's never a great thing when we have to pull together this podcast again. So I think it really came as no surprise to many of us, certainly us on this podcast, and many legal experts following these boat strikes, that the administration decided to release these individuals so quickly. And I think it's fairly telling with respect to what it says about their legal position and also what they think about their legal position, frankly. So I think for many lay people who've been listening to the president's rhetoric on this, he's been calling these people narco-terrorists, he's been saying that we're at war. So there was probably an expectation, and certainly that was what I was hearing from people, that the government was going to seek to detain them under a law of war framework, because that's historically what we do when the United States has captured individuals that it deemed dangerous in the context of an armed conflict with a terrorist actor. It's typically sought, if those individuals are actually combatants in that conflict, to detain them and, frankly, to interrogate them. And in this case, there's an obvious reason why the United States did not seek to detain these individuals further. And that is that if they'd detained these individuals anywhere where the writ of habeas runs, so if they brought these individuals to, for example, Guantanamo or to the United States, they would have received habeas corpus. The government would have had to make its case before a federal judge. They would have had to claim what they've been claiming rhetorically. They've been claiming to Congress and they've been claiming in the press that these individuals are combatants, that they're actual fighters as part of an organized armed group that's in an authorized armed conflict with the United States. In the context of detention historically, in order to detain people, that's been a congressionally authorized armed conflict. And in this case, not one of these things are true. We've been saying this repeatedly, and this would be an opportunity for the courts to weigh in. And when the president presumably lost that case, and if the courts are functioning properly, he would lose that case. This would mean it wouldn't be just a ruling on his detention authority. It would actually undermine the government's entire framework for using force in this conflict. So in other words, the government didn't want to risk a court weighing in on their use of force because they knew that it wouldn't hold up. And so I think that's why they clearly did not choose to detain these individuals. Now, there's another alternative that they could have taken. If the armed conflict theory does not hold water, if they didn't want to litigate that, they could have simply chosen to prosecute these individuals. So if the government has, as it claims, slam dunk evidence that these individuals are narco-terrorists, sufficient, by the way, to kill them, right? Then they could have chosen to take these individuals to the United States and to prosecute them in federal courts. And typically that is what the United States has done in cases outside of armed conflict, or even at times inside of armed conflict, when the government has evidence that individuals are conspiring to commit acts of terrorism, which is the government's claim here. So yes, in some cases, the government might eventually turn such individuals over to another country that has a significant interest in prosecuting them themselves, but usually that would require some time. A state just can't create a prosecution out of thin air. And I think it's fair to assume here, given that the United States had just blown up this boat and was not seeking to create this detention situation, that this handover was sprung on Colombia and Ecuador. And I think there's information out there that suggests that at least one of these people has already been released, in fact.
So to boil that down, Beck, such a helpful overview. What you're saying is detention is the only circumstance that we've at least been able to identify to date where courts might actually get involved in this whole situation. Because when someone is detained by the United States in a jurisdiction where the writ of habeas corpus runs, which would certainly include, Guantanamo, that's been litigated, would certainly include U.S. territory, but likely other places in the neighborhood as well, that they get their day in court to say, I'm not lawfully being detained by the military. That's what we're saying when we talk about habeas extending to those individuals. And then a court would get to say, yes or no, is there an armed conflict? Yes or no, even if there is an armed conflict, are these people combatants, right? And those are questions that by transferring these individuals out of US custody, courts will not be able to answer unless additional detainees are taken, right, as these strikes continue. So where do you see this going from here if the administration continues to take strikes? And they have, in fact, taken another strike since this one that resulted in the 2 survivors being detained. Are we going to see a detention program, right? Are there people scrambling right now to figure out what to do with the next survivors? Would it be a resurgence of detention at Guantanamo? If so, and just generally kind of how do you see the detainee issue playing out going forward?
Yeah, that's a great question. I think we've all heard this question a lot. I've certainly had people ask me whether the administration is going to start bringing people to Guantanamo. And also, just as an aside to that, there's this assumption that I've heard a lot that if we somehow start bringing people to Guantanamo, that would actually be indicative of their guilt in some way. That if we're bringing people to Guantanamo, that somehow would suggest that those were terrorists. And so I just want to first do away with that idea entirely. Guantanamo is just a place. It's actually a naval base, right? And it has happened to hold DoD detention facilities since the early months of 9/11. But the government bringing people to Guantanamo doesn't make them terrorists any more than the government blowing up people makes them terrorists, any more than zip tying children outside of an apartment building in Chicago makes those children criminals. And so the one thing that actually does make Guantanamo special today is that the Supreme Court decided in 2008 that the writ of habeas corpus extends to detention there. And so what that means is that if the government were to bring people to Guantanamo to hold them, they're going to have to explain themselves in court. And so, as I've said before, and as you just said, they're going to need to claim that they're combatants, that they're actual fighters, that they're involved in an organized armed group in a congressionally authorized armed conflict with the United States, which we absolutely don't have here. None of those things are true. And my view is that there are many people inside the government that know that this legal theory does not hold water and that it would not stand up in court. And I think those voices prevailed when they decided to repatriate these people this weekend. And so the question is, will those voices continue to prevail? If those voices prevail, we will not see Guantanamo detention. But the government is going to need to decide what to do in cases like this one. I think we can assume that, given this is not the first time they were not successful in their attempt to kill everyone on board that boat the first time, that there will be more survivors in the future. And So the question will be, and certainly if they start an armed conflict, but in this case, the question will be, what will they do if they bring these individuals to Guantanamo? That is a suggestion that they have some actual belief in their legal theory, or that they're making a huge mistake. If they choose to bring them somewhere else, I think we should fairly assume, if they choose to bring them to some place where the writ does not run, or if they choose to hand them over to another state for custody, which I would argue would continue to be constructive custody in the United States, depending on the circumstances, then I think that it's fair to say that suggests that they don't actually have a lot of faith in their legal theory, which clearly they should not.
And
I would concur with all of that. If I could jump in here, and just say that, when I first got wind over the summer of this scheme to, bomb boats in the Caribbean, one of my very first questions is, what will be the basis for any detention? Okay. As you probably in your own experience encountered, when you're engaged in interagency planning for counterterrorism operations, one of the things you have to figure out is the disposition pathway for any detainees. Do you have your own legal authority to hold them under the law of war? Are they covered by the an AUMF? Can you pursue criminal charges against them? Are you going to hand them off to a partner force for law of war detention, a partner force for criminal prosecution? And so that was like one of the very first things that occurred to me. It's not clear whether that planning took place at the front end for these operations, or whether they had to sort of scramble around after this happened with respect to the survivors. One concern, and this is a concern that was discussed repeatedly during the actual war on terror against actual terrorists, such as Al-Qaeda, is whether the legal headaches associated with detention and challenges to detention authority create perverse incentives against taking prisoners, will create perverse incentives against rescuing people from the sea. One surely hopes not.
Yeah, I want to weigh in on that just real quick, because I think people might be wondering, like, why were there survivors, right? Why did they pick these people up? And I've been thinking about this a lot, because I think what it suggests to me, and this is just my guess as to what happened, is that the people who were willing to carry out the president's orders here, to kill these people in these circumstances, they had to accept the legal framework that the president was giving them, that this was an armed conflict, in order to do that. And they had to accept the theory that these were combatants. And so let's imagine that they've accepted this legal theory, which is wrong, that these people were combatants in an armed conflict. But even if they accepted that the president's decision by fiat, basically handed down, that these were combatants, it's still
a classified OLC memo that no one has seen, right?
Right. Let's say they defer to this OLC memo, right? They know that it is still a war crime to kill people who are hors de combat, due to, for example, wounds or shipwreck, right? And so for those soldiers who are stuck here between the president's orders and their duty to obey the law, which is already the most impossible of circumstances that the president has placed them, I think that killing or leaving behind these survivors, that obvious war crime in the moment, was just clearly a bridge too far.
Yep. And so to put a finer point on that for listeners, intentionally killing the wounded or shipwrecked at sea is kind of a 101 example of what it is to commit a war crime during an armed conflict. Here, right, we're not in an armed conflict, so what you're doing still amounts to murder. You're murdering civilians. But if, as you say, Beck, the theory has been accepted that an armed conflict framework is what's governing these activities and making it permissible for us to be shooting this boat in the first instance, it still doesn't get you to killing intentionally the sick, the wounded, the shipwrecked at sea, who need to be collected and cared for, is the terminology. And it seems like that's what the Navy did here, is they collected and cared for and then transferred out of their custody within a reasonable time frame the people who survived that, what was in the first instance an unlawful attack, but nevertheless the survivors were collected and cared for.
And it suggests that, when there's no orders to the contrary, and this was true in the immediate aftermath of 9/11, also when the U.S. military started treating Al-Qaeda detainees as prisoners of war, because that was what they were trained to do. When there's no orders to the contrary, the U.S. military is going to sort of operate under its normal protocols. And so, certainly people aren't going to commit war crimes. I think it's fair to say that this is evidence that people aren't going to commit war crimes in such circumstances on a whim.
Right. So speaking of the the circumstances here, we can zoom out a little bit now because unfortunately we've been at this for almost what 8 weeks, 6 weeks now. We haven't seen the tempo of operations slowing. We've seen 7 strikes that are acknowledged to date. And this is alongside a massive military buildup in the Caribbean, with lots of military assets having been deployed to the region before these strikes even began. Right. And the question now that arises is, where is all of this headed? Right. If we have, first of all, people of different nationalities being targeted, we have ostensibly that we know of. We think we have Colombians, Venezuelans, Ecuadorians. I think there's also reporting that some others had been from Trinidad and Tobago. So we have a range of nationalities here representing a swath of the region. Um, we have more than 30 people dead. The current reporting is 32 people have been killed. And we certainly don't have a vacuum of rhetoric, right, towards Venezuela at minimum, but more recently Colombia as well, in terms of the administration not really mincing words about its, intent to see different governments in some of these countries, most notably Maduro in Venezuela, is a frequent target for the Trump administration. So, Brian, can you talk us through how this all adds up? And sorry, one more data point here. The talking point from the administration is usually just framed as combating drugs, narco terrorists, without specifying who we're talking about, which drugs. There's a lot of hyperbole flying around. Um, but certainly, the facts as far as the U.S. intelligence community is concerned, based on a national intelligence estimate or a National Intelligence Council memo, excuse me, from April of this year, is that the Venezuelan government, in fact, does not have much of a role, is not substantially involved with Tren de Aragua or any related drug trafficking activities of that group. So what exactly is it that the Trump administration is leading us towards? What path are we on here with this series of strikes, with the number of different individuals of different nationalities involved, and with the broader buildup in the region? Brian, can you talk us through your views on where we might be headed more broadly?
So there are a lot of moving parts here, and I think there's 3 main themes we have, though. One are the performative, lethal, and illegal strikes against supposed narco terrorists in the Caribbean. The Trump administration has characterized these people aboard these vessels who've not been identified and their affiliations have not been revealed to be, terrorists. Has claimed repeatedly, without evidence, that they are smuggling fentanyl to the United States that will kill Americans. Um, I think these strikes in some ways represent a consolation prize for people who in the administration might actually want to do drone strikes in Mexico against actual fentanyl labs or cartel members who are producing fentanyl that actually is trafficked to the United States. That would be catastrophic for a number of reasons, including for U.S. Mexican bilateral relations, cooperation on migration, cooperation on law enforcement, including on drug enforcement, counter narcotics. And so wiser heads and cooler heads in the administration prevailed and forestalled actual U.S. military action in Mexico. But strikes in the Caribbean and international waters, pose fewer foreign policy headaches from the standpoint of the administration, while also providing the president and others in the administration the satisfying spectacle of strikes on terrorists, right? Because otherwise, it's pretty hard to figure out why they're talking about fentanyl, why they're talking about terrorists when none of that's actually in play here with respect to whoever it is they're blowing up in the Caribbean. Because what's aboard those boats, whether it's cocaine, fish, marijuana, it's not fentanyl. Okay, so that's sort of one theme here, is the one sort of a set of agendas within the administration is performative action against supposed terrorists. Another one is regime change in Caracas, and that explains the broader military buildup, the guided missile destroyers, the Marine Expeditionary Unit, the F-35B fighters. This is about saber rattling towards Maduro, and largely driven by Secretary of State Marco Rubio. And the goal here, the hope is that this military buildup will either convince Maduro to relinquish power, um, step down, or embolden elements within his government to topple him, to push him aside. Okay. Both of those objectives seem fairly fantastical. My colleagues at Crisis Group are pretty skeptical that they will succeed. Thus far, we've had this buildup since August in the Caribbean. Maduro is still very much in power. Um, and I think there's real questions that even if the U.S. were to be able to manage regime change along these lines, whether the outcomes would be beneficial for Venezuela or the United States. What would, if the regime change would be clean and tidy, as some advocates in the administration might hope. Okay. And then more recently, we've had another flare up in the ongoing tensions between President Trump and the Colombian leader, Gustavo Petro. This has been going on for much of Trump's second term. Early on, soon after President Trump was inaugurated for the second time, the United States was trying to fly back Colombian deportees to Colombia. The Colombian president alleged they'd been mistreated, refused the flight. There was a blow up between the two of them on social media that resulted in threats of tariffs and cuts in aid. That was eventually worked through, but more recently has been another flare up. Petro had his visa revoked when he went to visit the UN General Assembly, and now he has criticized President Trump for the killing of what he claims was a Colombian fisherman in one of the earlier strikes in September, leading President Trump to threaten to cut aid to Colombia anew. And I want to, I'm emphasizing that last theme as well, because I think it reflects in some ways the incoherence of U.S. foreign policy in this area. Because on the one hand, the most recent lethal strike that the administration has announced was allegedly against a vessel affiliated with the ELN, which is one of the main rebel groups in Colombia. And the main military fighting that rebel group is Colombia, and they're doing it with U.S. military support, financial support, which President Trump is threatening to cut off. And so the U.S. is really working at cross purposes with itself. And the Secretary of Defense is on the one hand comparing this group ELN to Al Qaeda, saying they threaten the United States and America. And on the other hand, the administration is threatening to handicap the ability of the Colombians to actually fight the ELN. And the ELN has been fighting the Colombians for 60 years. The Colombians have not managed to vanquish it. It's very doubtful whether the U.S. bombing some random boats in the Caribbean is going to accomplish much on that front. And I just emphasize, we don't know who was aboard that most recent vessel that was struck. The tweet from the Secretary of Defense talks about being affiliated with the ELN, but from what I hear from my colleagues in the region, they're very skeptical that there were actual ELN fighters aboard that vessel, as opposed to people being paid by the group to transport drugs. Again, the administration makes a lot of claims about people aboard these vessels, characterizes them as narco-terrorists, claims about what's aboard them, but it really has not substantiated any of those allegations.
Right. We don't know who's on board these vessels, what they're actually carrying, where they departed from, or where they're headed to. And that's been a problem with all of these strikes so far. So this is a pretty serious situation. We have a military buildup, on our borders, our maritime borders, but still, right here in our hemisphere, huge military buildup, threatening a nation that we're not at war with, regardless of what you think of the merits of that government being in power in Venezuela. We're certainly not in an armed conflict, and they have not committed an armed attack against us. And likewise, with Colombia, as you just laid out, Brian, our policy is at cross purposes with itself in terms of whether we're supporting, efforts against both guerrilla groups and drug trafficking that they may be involved with, in terms of whether the U.S. supports those efforts. So this is a big deal, right? We have, and as we've been talking about for all 3 episodes of this podcast now, at bottom, we have a campaign of killings outside of the law that the U.S. military is thus far carrying out. We should mention that the Southcom commander has said he's stepping down, not tomorrow. He's doing it in an orderly way, but we haven't seen resignations, whistleblowing, and the like tied directly to any of these killings thus far. It feels like this should be a bigger deal on the Hill. and with the American public as well. So maybe staying with you, Brian, first for a moment with what Congress has been doing and what they could be doing. Um, what's going on the Hill with respect to these strikes, and what should we watch for next?
Well, I should say that congressional response to these actions in the Caribbean and potentially against Venezuela itself, which I'll get into in a moment, is complicated by the ongoing government shutdown. But on the 8th of October, there was a vote on legislation introduced by Senators Schiff and Senators Kane to bar further U.S. military action in the Caribbean, further strikes in these boats. Received bipartisan support, but not a majority support in the Senate. More recently, Senator Kane has introduced new legislation that would bar U.S. military action against Venezuela itself. And this is co-sponsored again by Senator Schiff and also by Senator Paul of Kentucky. So bipartisan support. And I think they are probably reading the same newspaper articles you and I are reading and hearing the same stories on the radio that you and I are hearing about the administration's bellicose rhetoric towards Venezuela. Okay, they've characterized the people on these boats as narco-terrorists, but they're also characterizing the Venezuelan president as a narco-terrorist. And they allege that he is the leader of the so-called Cartel de Soles, which is allegedly made up of senior Venezuelan military officers. My colleagues tell me that there is no such cartel, but it's nonetheless concerning because you can see this providing a pretext for strikes on land, which President Trump has mused about out loud on several occasions. And so in terms of where this is heading with respect to the U.S. strikes, the president's joked about the running out of targets in the Caribbean and moving on to land. I think it's plausible that they could, if U.S. saber rattling fails to dislodge Maduro, that they may move on to strikes on land. Strikes affiliated with the government of Maduro, potential drug labs in Venezuela, or even most concerningly, potentially a decapitation strike on Maduro himself. And so I think that it's important that Congress push back against any unauthorized military action in Venezuela, but particularly that aimed at regime change.
Beck, over to you. What do you think are implications going forward, and how should we be reacting?
Look, I know people are shrugging this off. I think there's a lot of reason for concern here, beyond the strict illegality of these strikes. Internationally, as Brian mentioned, we're watching a very quick escalation here, and this has implications both for the immediate risk of conflict with these particular countries, but also for the sort of global world order going forward. To the extent we're threatening force against these countries, that itself is a violation of the UN Charter. So we are eroding that norm, the very clear rule that prohibits not just the use of force, but the threat of the use of force. We've been eroding the rules, obviously, prohibiting the extrajudicial killing of people, of prohibiting aggression. And just imagine if other states decided to follow suit and thought that, okay, well, why bother trying people? We can just kill suspected criminals ourselves. So both in terms of the rules governing states' actions toward just individuals, just human beings, and the rules governing states' relationships with each other, this is just a terrible, very quick erosion of both at the same time. And so those consequences are horrifying. And then domestically, I think people think of this as something, Americans, many who are shrugging these strikes off, think this is just something that's happening far away that doesn't concern them. But the president has been already very clear that he's trying to use wartime and war-related authorities across a range of domestic interests, in the interests of pursuing his immigration agenda, in the interest of pursuing a law enforcement agenda, in the interest of fighting his political enemies. He has been rounding up and trying to deport people under the Alien Enemies Act, under the same theories that were involved in an armed conflict. And we've got the president and his administration characterizing domestic actors as terrorists, just as he's talking about using force in American cities. So this is not something that is just happening far away. This is something that's happening right here in American cities. And I think that we have talked repeatedly on this podcast about the fact that there is no limiting principle to the president's legal theory. Now, people might think, well, who cares about law here? But the point of law is to divide a line between when the president can use force against people and when he can't, right? And if there is no limiting principles of the president's legal claim, that means he is claiming authority to use force in ways that could be used on American soil as well. And so when we think about the range of actors against whom the president is willing to use war-related authorities or use war-related rhetoric, I think we should all be extremely concerned.
So we've got at least 5 things we're keeping our here together. One is, will the administration develop a detention policy if they don't have one already? I think our collective view was they sure ought to, because it would be unlawful to kill the sick or wounded if we were even in an armed conflict paradigm, but it's of course also unlawful to murder these people in the first instance or once they're sick or wounded, because we're in fact not in an armed conflict. So either way, they ought to be figuring out what they're going to do with survivors or others who might end up coming into their custody. 2, we have our eye on the War Powers resolution that Brian mentioned, where Congress is going to get a chance to weigh in prospectively, trying to prohibit a use of force against Venezuela. We also have the War Powers Resolution clock that's been running since early September, when the administration provided a report to Congress required by the War Powers Resolution within 48 hours of introduction of U.S. forces into hostilities. And that War Powers Resolution requires that those forces be removed from hostilities within 60 days unless Congress authorizes them, which it has not done. So we're keeping our eyes on November 4th for when that 60-day clock would run. We're looking at the potential broader application of some of these types of legal theories against other types of enemies that the president may choose to label as terrorists or otherwise. And related to that, of course, the broader erosion of the rules separating us from chaos, quite frankly, separating the rule of law from the rule of one man who can, in his discretion, order killings, which is a really chilling reality that we've been trying to focus people's attention on for the last several weeks as we've been getting together. I do hope we stop meeting this way, but in the interest of trying to break these things down for people, is there anything else that you'd add to that list of what you're keeping your eye on, or any other parting thoughts?
Honestly, I think that sums it up for me.
That's excellent, Tess. I would just say that the prerogative being asserted here is a license to kill outside the law, and that should trouble all Americans.
Well, thank you both for coming back on, and I hope when we meet again, it's to do a post-mortem of this whole thing having wrapped up. But if not, stay tuned as we track those issues. And it's been a pleasure speaking with you today. The Just Security podcast was hosted by me, Tess Bridgeman, and produced by Maya Neer and Isaac Rubenstein. Special thanks to both of our guests, Rebecca Ingber and Brian Finucane. You can listen to installments 1 and 2 of Murder on the High Seas wherever you get your podcasts, or watch them on Just Security's YouTube channel. For a comprehensive, open source, and living resource on war powers, please check out the show notes for a link to the War Powers Resolution Reporting Project at NYU Law's Reese Center on Law and Security. And if you enjoyed listening to this episode, please give us a 5-star rating on Apple Podcasts or wherever you listen.